Block. Hello, everybody. I am Lauren Block with Pathways to Resilience. Today, we are having a learning network session entitled Creating Physical Spaces to Foster Healing and Resilience with Trauma-Informed Design. We are really excited because we have 4 amazing speakers. As some of you may know, Pathways to Resilience is a nationwide initiative to promote cross-sector strategies for preventing trauma and promoting resilience and healing. We are excited today to discuss extending trauma-responsive principles to the spaces and settings in which we live. I'm sure that all of you have walked into a space, whether it's a doctor's room, a classroom, or a courtroom, and felt immediately unwelcomed, and maybe even unsafe in that space. Hopefully, you have also experienced the opposite, entering a space and feeling safe and secure and welcomed. These experiences can really be amplified for individuals who have experienced trauma, and the settings in which we inhabit can have a powerful, can be powerful for us. And whether it's a community building or an outdoor space, they can help promote healing and resilience, or they can do the opposite. So our speakers today are going to address the ways in which we can thoughtfully and intentionally alter spaces to better serve people who have experienced trauma. We believe that trauma-informed design is really for every sector, and you will hear today from our speakers more about different spaces that they have designed. Many teachers already infuse their classrooms with trauma-informed principles. Community congregation settings often arrange their spaces to be conducive to conversation and relationship building. And we have speakers today who have worked, again, within all these different sectors and spaces to think about what it is that children and adults alike need to be able to really be successful and to have the best experiences wherever they are. We are joined by former First Lady, Mrs. Lauren Baker of Massachusetts, who's going to speak about the work that she has done in the past and continues to support in her state. We're also joined by Mike Lindstrom from Studio MLA, who has worked extensively on child-serving spaces like schools and early childcare settings. We have Dana McKinney of Geary Partners, who has a focus on the justice sector and alternatives to correctional facilities. And Laura Rosbert, who works for Shopworks Architects, who formerly ran a homeless shelter and now supports the development and design of spaces for people experiencing homelessness. So I'm excited to have Mrs. Baker kick us off with some remarks. So I'll turn it to you now, Mrs. Baker.
Thanks, Lauren. I just have to say how excited I am to be part of this discussion today, and really thank you to the Pathways team for pulling it all together. And thank all of you for joining in on this discussion. As Lauren said, I'm the former First Lady of Massachusetts, and my primary initiative in that role was to improve the lives of children engaged with our Massachusetts child welfare system. So I founded a nonprofit called the Wonder Fund, and its sole purpose is to serve the needs of children engaged with the Department of Children and Families. A huge part of our work was learning to understand the impact of trauma on health and well-being and identifying ways that we can mitigate that impact for kids. Today, we're going to focus on a key way that we learned that we can make a huge impact for families who've experienced trauma by simply changing our design choices. The term trauma-informed design is probably a relatively new term in the world of design, but I think in practice, it's not a totally new concept. To me, trauma-informed design is all about understanding how trauma impacts people and how we can use that understanding to create environments that help users of a space feel comfortable, cared for, and safe. In Massachusetts, our child welfare agency is called the Department of Children and Families, or DCF, and everyone who's engaged with DCF has endured some kind of trauma in their family. And through our work with DCF, the Wonder Fund observed that when families come to DCF offices for supervised visits, they use visitation rooms that are really just part of the DCF office space. These are really stressful meetings for everyone involved. And when the rooms are unwelcoming and sterile, that just makes it even harder. Could you show the first slide? Thanks. So the Wonder Fund decided that with some simple changes to these visitation rooms, we could make a huge difference for the people who use them. If we could reduce everyone's stress and make people feel even a little bit more comfortable, we could help improve the outcomes of these meetings, which means we could improve the experience of family visits for the children we serve. What you're looking at is a toolkit that we created based on our learning on these transformations. So for this renovation project, we relied heavily on our understanding of trauma-informed principles, as well as an understanding of the people who use these rooms. We wanted to give users a feeling of safety, comfort, dignity, and agency. And we focused on color, furnishings, layout, lighting, and artwork. We renovated over 100 family visiting rooms and witnessed how when a room is designed with trauma-informed principles in mind, families can just relax and be together. These weren't difficult changes to make, but the impact was huge. Can you switch to the next one, Lizzie? It doesn't really cost any more money to choose a soothing color or a comfortable chair. It just really takes making a trauma-informed decision. So I'm really delighted to be a part of this work, and I can't wait for all of you to experience what it's like to see how your design choices can truly change someone else's experience for the better. Now I'm going to kick it back to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Baker. This session is really exciting to me because it's wonderful to be able to take the concepts and the theories and see them visually in a way that you don't always get to in other areas. As Mrs. Baker mentioned, the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families is really focused on infusing trauma-responsive principles in the design of their visitation spaces. We're now going to hear a little bit more from Mike, who's going to introduce himself and tell us a bit about his role in this work.
Thanks, Lauren. So my name is Mike Lindstrom. I'm an architect. I'm a principal at Studio MLA Architects in Brookline, Massachusetts. We're a firm of about 15 people, architects and landscape architects. And our main focus area is children and families and community spaces, early education, things like that. And that's sort of how we came to trauma-informed design. I think the first project where we even sort of heard the term or knew about it was, curiously enough, in Washoe County near Reno. And we were working for Department of Children and Family Services county office who wanted to create an outdoor space to encourage family engagement and to support family visits and conversations. I think that we worked with the local health services agency on some of their spaces. And then we met Lauren Baker when we were working with the Horizons for Homeless Children, creating their headquarters and a childcare center for 250 children of families that were currently homeless. So that project, we were asked to really focus on how can we support children and families that are living these traumatic circumstances. I think as we heard, trauma-informed design is a really new field. So there's been some great work done, but I think it's different for every project and for every setting. So we were really excited to be asked to help out with the Massachusetts DCF project and to take the work that the Wonder Fund's done and help to try to institutionalize it and help to spread it throughout the DCF offices and beyond just the family visitation spaces. So we've done a lot of focus groups, trying to really get insights from the people who use the spaces and inhabit the spaces, site visits, and really tried to go back and develop what we're calling a toolkit for design, where hopefully going forward, the state will, as a part of its normal design and procurement process, fold in trauma-informed thinking into the design process.
Thank you so much, Mike. Mrs. Baker, did you want to maybe discuss just briefly also a little bit about how the language that's been used in contracts and procurement opportunities in the state? I don't know if you wanted to discuss that any further, and how other states might consider that.
Well, I'm by no means any expert. I can't talk to you about the language, but working
Concept.
with Mike and our like basically the COO of the Department of Children and Families, we talked about how important it would be going forward as state agencies were trying to come back from the pandemic, where everyone went, everybody basically went home and no one was coming into the office. That provided an opportunity for state agencies to start thinking about what they call the future of work. So if we're going to only bring back a third of our staff at a time on any given day, we should rethink how we use the offices. And so I said, if you're going to rethink how you use the offices, take a look at these family visiting rooms. They're so welcoming and warm, and they make such a difference for the families who use them and for the social workers who supervise the visits. Apply that thinking to your entire office. There's no reason why social workers who have just the most challenging jobs, why can't they have a beautiful space to walk into? And I used the staff areas that Mike designed at Horizons for Homeless Children to say, this is what it could be. Because what Mike and his team did there is like, I want to move in. Like, it is so beautiful. And I just, we showed these spaces to DCF and said, you already have a budget for office furniture. So instead of choosing the black metal chair, choose a different chair that's more comfortable and welcoming. And, it took us, I don't know, like 9 months to get them to put this into their process. So now every lease that DCF renegotiates is going to have input from, Mike or, their whole trauma-informed design team, so that will impact the build out, the colors, the finishes, everything about a new lease. And so that's, I think
the other thing, Lauren, we appreciated about the procurement process was that they went through a qualifications-based selection process for the designers, and then created kind of an open-ended contract, because it wasn't really clear what the best way to impact their overall system for designing and building out spaces. So I think the flexibility that we had within that was really appreciable, I think.
And I see we're getting a lot of questions for links, and we are going to post all the slides that you're going to see to our to the takeaways that we write in the end. And we will also we have a link to the general part of our resource library. We're going to add a new link so you can see that is only going to refer to the documents that we're talking about here today. So you will be able to access everything after the fact if you, so don't worry about that. I am now going to have Dana introduce herself. I did not do her introduction justice and that I had a mix up. Apologies. We have so many wonderful speakers here, but Dana is an architect and urban planner with Harvard Graduate School of Design, Studio Kin and Enfold Collective. So Dana, I will turn it to you now, and apologies for that.
Thank you. And no worries at all. I used to be at Gary Partners till about two years ago. But so again, my name is Dana McKinney, and I'm an architect and urban planner by trade, but more recently have joined the faculty at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design in the Department of Urban Planning and Design. So I really focus on vulnerabilities in space and trauma-informed design decisions that we can do, not just within individual architecture, but as we apply it to more urban conditions. So within neighborhoods and communities within the entire city fabric. I also run two businesses, one of which is a consulting company where I talk with other architects who may not have familiarity with trauma-informed design decisions, as well as municipalities and county agencies that are looking to integrate these ideas into their work. And then I also have an upsetting design practice, which is a little bit more on the speculative side. And we do projects that are looking to integrate community feedback directly in so that there's a greater sense of ownership within the work that we're producing. I've come into this work over the last few years through two sort of coinciding interests of mine, one of which is alternatives to incarceration, dealing with sort of the mass incarceration of our country, and then the trauma that results in, as well as persons experiencing homelessness, which we are seeing has been explosively growing across the country. And there are a lot of intersectionalities between these different populations. There's a lot of crossover between them. And so really trying to understand these individuals who are basically at most risk within our society and the ways in which we can start to unlearn design practices of our past that have caused greater traumas, such as the window widths in jail cells, which are often only 3 inches wide, or the uses of different types of materials, so very hard concretes and steel. And so really looking at sort of the atmospheric and sensorial qualities of spaces as they are, not just traumatizing people, but as a way to really help them to resolve the trauma that has been occurred against them. And so I'm really grateful to be here today and looking forward to the conversation ahead.
Thanks so much, Dana. Laura, I'm now going to turn it to you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your transition from organizational leadership to your current role at Shopworks Architecture.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, it's really great to be with these incredible speakers today. I feel deeply honored to be invited to this table. So thank you for having me. So I kind of fell into the trauma-informed design work. My background is in community organizing. My most recent job before this one was actually running a homeless shelter here in Denver. And I was responsible for implementing trauma-informed care within that shelter. Which has been a best practice for a number of decades and is a huge source of resources and a foundation for our trauma-informed design work. And while I was implementing trauma-informed care in our homeless shelter that served about 60 individuals a night, we were also designing supportive housing for folks who are unhoused moving into housing, a brand new homeless shelter from the ground up, and then 95 units of workforce family affordable housing with another nonprofit partner, Rocky Mountain Communities. So I was the interim executive director at the Dolores Project at this time. And we were receiving a training from somebody from SAMHSA about trauma-informed care. And literally at the last minute, I invited the architects to spend all day Saturday with us to learn about trauma-informed care and best practices. And it really blew the architect's mind, right? Architects are trained in fire, life safety, and oh my goodness, their job is very hard. But mental health isn't a conversation in architecture school, or it wasn't when all the folks here at Shopworks were getting trained. And so it really, in the design of Arroyo Village, was what that kind of continuum of housing and shelter was called. We started to ask these questions. What does it mean to understand individuals' experiences, their traumas, the traumas of staff, the vicarious trauma of staff, and how we designed a building. And so we created Arroyo Village, making our best guesses, asking questions of people. But even when we went to do research, we could find a little bit of research about what it meant to design a trauma-informed therapy office. But that's really different than designing a shelter or somebody's house. So then back in 2019, on a total whim, I asked Chad Holzinger, who founded Shopworks Architecture, if I could come join the team. And much to my surprise, he didn't laugh in my face as I anticipated. It was kind of the guttiest career move I've ever made. And he was like, we absolutely need you here. And so now I'm at Shopworks. And so I get to co-lead our trauma-informed design work with an incredible multidisciplinary team of people. I'm our COO. I like systems and structures. And then I also just help nonprofits navigate how to develop housing. A lot of our nonprofit partners are developing housing for the first time. And so in my job, I get to just kind of help them navigate those systems and make sure they know about grants and kind of fill in holes in capacity for building housing. And so I'm going to take just a couple minutes and share a very broad overview of the research we've been doing for the last 5 years and some things that we've learned. So if you all want to share the slides, I can dive deep into that. All right, so back in 2019, as I said, we partnered with the Center for Housing and Homelessness Research at the University of Denver, Group 14 Engineering here. And we just decided we need to figure out what trauma-informed design even means. So after Arroyo Village opened, we researched just 3 sites and talked to about 60 folks and said, where do you feel safe? Where are you developing community? What do you like about this building you live in? What don't you like? And we put together our initial framework. Fast forward to today, we've actually interviewed, and this slide is a couple weeks old. Now we've interviewed over 1,800 folks, generally folks who are either currently unsheltered or unhoused, or folks who are staying in a shelter, or folks who have moved into either supportive or other affordable housing, as well as frontline staff that, you know, are sometimes in a building at 2 a.m. and that feels really different than how it felt to me, right, as an admin person who was there generally from 9 to 5. So that has formed a deep base for our work. We've impacted over 45 buildings in the US and Canada, which is always strange. And we have some trauma-informed design trainings we've put together. Really, the goal is to help the field with that. And so we've had a very big last 4 years, much to our surprise. You can go to the next slide. So after those initial interviews, we put together our first guess at this framework, right? We talked to some folks, ensuring we are prioritizing the voice of individuals with lived expertise. And we put together this original framework, you know, really thinking about comfort, community, and choice, and then how this building really walks alongside a broad group of people and lives within a cultural identity experience of neighborhoods. Next slide. We have a paper coming out in just 2 weeks, hopefully, fingers crossed, which is our updated framework. We've sought to simplify our framework. And after, you know, our initial one was created from 60 interviews, this is impacted by over 1,800, really thinking about what these values are, what it means to design trauma-informed spaces. So at the center, we have safety, and then we have our 3 C's, comfort, connection, and choice, which I'm going to go into in very brief detail. But then acknowledging that buildings exist within ecosystems. So, right, we saw buildings we had created that were beautiful and were trauma-informed, and then COVID hit and property management shut down all the beautiful amenity spaces. Well, now instead of those beautiful amenity spaces creating healing, they're actually super triggering for the residents, right? And so as we think about trauma-informed design, it lives within all of these things, the programs and services, the property management, and those external factors that can be a wild card, it feels, all deeply informed the experience of each building. And then we invite folks to know, learn, and commit, to know about this work, to learn more, to be curious, to maybe unlearn some unhelpful ideas about communities of people, and to really seek to constantly being better. And that's what we seek to do as our team. We don't think we know everything, but we think we have some thoughts, and we try to share them with the universe, and then we shift and change them when we get good feedback. So now I'm going to go, next slide, really talk about the core of our trauma-informed design framework. So you can go to the next slide. So when, you know, in this one, we really shifted to safety being first and foremost, because if folks do not feel safe, nothing else matters, right? They can have choices. They're not going to make those choices because their body is putting them in fight, flight, or freeze. And when we're talking about safety, we're talking about real safety. Is it safe? But we're also talking about whether it feels safe. And whether it feels safe is deeply informed by individuals' identities and experiences coming into a space. And so we think about broad lighting coverage, we think about camera coverage, We talk about locks, we talk about key fobs. Dana, I was thinking, we were redoing an employment office for folks who are exiting incarceration, right? And we had a 15-minute conversation in a focus group about what doorknobs were used in prison and jail and showed up in the first draft of this employment office, right? You have to engage in deep conversations and get to know communities for this work to be meaningful and to have the impact that you intend it to have. Next slide. Then we think about comfort. One of the things we learned, Dr. Jennifer Wilson is on our team. She's our researcher. We stole her away from the university and she now works at ShopWorks. But one of the pieces of feedback she gave us was laundry rooms are really triggering for folks who are unhoused who have moved into housing. And it was like, obviously, right? And so we shifted to doing laundry spas in all of our buildings. How can a parent with children hang out with those kids while the laundry is going and not have to leave their worldly possessions in another room while they go back to their apartment unit, right? How are we creating things like rocking chairs and cozy nooks, elements that suggest front porches, natural elements and beautiful artwork? Okay, next slide. And then we think about connection. What helps all of us heal is fellow human beings. And so we think a lot about how our buildings help facilitate staff and resident connections, resident and resident connections, and even residents and the surrounding neighborhood. So we think about entranceways to buildings that are low barrier. You can see what's going on inside. You can decide if you're engaging or not engaging. And then we think a lot about staff office being close to resident amenity spaces. We find they get used that way. If they're on another floor, they won't. Next slide. And then we think about choice. A key part of trauma-informed care is empowerment. So giving folks opportunities to be right smack dab in the middle of something or off to the side as well. Next slide. And so as we think about this work, it's also requesting that design teams do their own work. We go when we talk to residents or potential shelter guests for every building that we design. We believe what they say and believe that they know their own experience. And then we design buildings that meet the needs that they say, not our thoughts over what their needs ought to be. And so we encourage folks to do anti-racism work, to think about gender, to think about how buildings are a part of systems of power that we need to stand up against. Next slide. And I ran through all of this really quickly, but I invite you to visit our website. Our new trauma-informed design white paper will be out literally in 2 weeks. But we have a 4-phase process that walks you through how to do a TID process on every development. It comes with a manual that's like literally step-by-step. Have the team read this resource, ask residents these questions, put together a report that looks like this. Then we have a document on architectural principles put together by Dr. Sam Grabowska and Chad Holtinger here at ShopWorks. And then we have that initial framework that'll be phased out as we bring in that new one. So thank you all for your time. I tried to be very brief. There's a lot of depth I did not get to.
Thanks so much, Laura. A lot of really meaty content there, I think, that folks can look to and build upon. We're going to hear a lot more from everyone, but I just wanted to give an opportunity for Dana and Mike to reflect and add anything. We heard about the 3 C's from Laura, but any other additional elements that you want to talk about that you prioritize in your work?
I can just jump in quickly. I mean, I just want to say I'm so appreciative of you, Laura, and the work that you guys are doing in terms of the engagement and really starting to ask people questions and having really difficult conversations about sometimes really nuanced things, such as the door handle. And it's something that in design school, we don't really talk about. And so I think it's really easy for a lot of designers to make decisions based off of habit or because something's been value engineered or, it's just what you're used to. And we don't really understand the implications of those decisions. In a lot of my work, it's something I definitely consider doing, and I actively ask questions like, what are the triggers for you? And so like you hear a lot about people having light sensitivity, and just like how much light is actually sliding underneath the door, or if there's the slot for mail, or in jail cells and prison cells, there's slots for food. And so those little narrow spaces and thin windows, there's a lot of sensitivity to these items. And so I think just having those conversations, writing them into these white papers, and and then actually exposing them is so productive for the field, because I think it's very easy for people to kind of glaze over those issues.
Thanks, Dana. Mike, anything you want to add?
Well, I would just agree 100% with Dana about Laura and Shopworks' work, which has really, been groundbreaking, and we've certainly leaned on what they've done a lot. I think in terms of other data points, because we're coming at it from a slightly different place in terms of our focus on children and families and our work with DCF, we went back to the SAMHSA trauma-informed practice guidelines, emphasizing safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, peer support, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural history, and gender issues, and tried to think, well, what are the design implications of those things? And some are simple, some are not quite so simple. I think it takes a lot of reflection and practice. I also appreciate Laura's emphasis on the idea that this is an iterative process and that nobody really has all the answers today. So by going through it, trying it out, seeing what works, feeding that back into the loop is really important. I think then from our own design experience, we added 4 more data points. One is biophilia, connection to nature, another universal design, movement, and what we call balanced sensory experience as things where we feel like the design process and the what we know about space can also sort of feed into what makes sense for trauma-informed design. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but that's sort of the other components that we think about when we're working on this kind of project.
Yeah, and actually, Mike, I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit more about biophilia. And again, for anyone who didn't catch it, that is the human desire to connect with nature and other living beings. So if you can talk a little bit more about how that is incorporated into your child serving spaces, that would be fantastic.
Sure. And I think we have a couple slides for this.
We do.
Pull up the first one. So as I said, our background is really working on children's environments. And we have, known for a long time that it's very important for child development to have connections and contact with nature. If you go to the next slide, one more. And I think we've realized, there's lots of these. Look at those. Yeah. We can pause here for a second. And so we've also come to realize, I think in our work in trauma-informed design, the power of natural elements and being in nature can have on just the mental health and well-being of everyone, but especially people who have been affected by trauma. So we try to pull that into all of our projects and think about this. Just going to walk you through one example, which is a Child Development Center at Penn State University. So this is not a particularly traumatized population, but it is child development, and it was a program that had a particular interest in engaging children with nature. I would also say that in our trauma-informed design work with DCF, one of the things we've realized is that there's a lot of untapped potential, I think, in a lot of places for integrating nature into spaces. If you go to the next slide, and that can happen both inside and outside. So this is one of the classrooms, and there's several elements I think that play into this idea of bringing nature inside. One is just lots of windows and light and views out to the exterior, keeping the people inside in contact with the seasons and the time of day. I think there's a centering and settling aspect to that, which is really important. And I think we all know the feeling of being in a windowless room and how it's a little, it's disconcerting. And you can only imagine that people who've suffered trauma can be even more disconcerting. I know in Dana's work, that's something that we've heard her talk about as well. We've also integrated a lot of natural materials into the interior space, and plants and natural ventilation, so that there can be fresh air as well. Go to the next slide. In this particular case, there was also a real interest in trying to find the crossover between biophilia and sustainability and child development and the pedagogy that they were using there, which was going to be informed by all of these things. So what you see this child playing on a cork floor, And one of the really interesting things for us is that the teachers in this classroom have actually taken the idea that there's a cork floor and extended that into the children's learning. So they're doing experiments with cork and understanding that it floats and what kind of material it is. They're learning about how it's sourced, how it's harvested from trees in Portugal every 5 years and it grows back. So it's a renewable resource. And I think just the idea that you can be in touch with a material that's not, plastic or metal or artificial, can have a big impact on lots of different people. The next slide, please. This project was built right on the edge of sort of the last stand of big trees on the Penn State campus. So we had to be extremely careful of the trees, and we were really only allowed to build in places where there had already been paving or already been building. But what it allowed us to do was really have a visual access to the outside. And once again, combined with natural ventilation and natural materials, I think there's a whole set of design strategies that we use to move a project toward a stronger connection to nature and allow the people to have a stronger connection to nature. And as I said, biophilia is one of a dozen really guiding principles that we're now working with in terms of trauma-informed design. And on any given project with any given population, on any given site, I think there are going to be some that you can really leverage and that'll make the biggest impact. And that's an important, I think, part of the process as well. If you go to the last slide, one of the things that we've certainly realized is that there is, in terms of biophilia, there's just no substitute for just being outside. And the return on investment for what you do outside is huge compared to building buildings in a lot of cases. So there's really just the natural plants and the fact that you're outside in the sunshine can have a big impact. So this is just an example, as I said, of one of the components of what we see as being important to trauma-informed design, but one that's honestly, very accessible to a lot of people if we can put it forward and get everybody to realize, yes, this is really important to value it.
Thanks so much, Mike. This is really helpful, and the visuals are really helpful to better understand and inspiring. Dana, I'd like to turn it to you to talk a little bit more about spatial rights and your experience in urban design and city planning as it relates to trauma responsive design.
Sounds great. You can turn to the slides. So I'm really just going to show you one speculative project that I've worked on for the city of Newark in New Jersey, which has a 1 in 4 lifetime likelihood of incarceration. And I just want everyone to sit with that statistic for a second, like 1 in 4 lifetime likelihood of being incarcerated. So this is a city that is predominantly Black and brown. It's over incarcerated. And then there are a lot of issues of perceptions of safety with blight and sort of a torn urban fabric. And so looking at how to redesign a relatively contested site for an alternative, which is not prison or jail, but is instead kind of leveraging the existing infrastructure of community supervision, which is probation and parole. If you go to the next slide. So this site right now, if you took out all that stuff in the middle, is actually empty. It is the historic site of one of the oldest affordable housing projects, or excuse me, public housing projects in the city of Newark, which was actually a segregated project built in the 1940s. It was torn down in 2012 because of blight, a really high incidence of crime and other sorts of illicit activity, and has been since sitting vacant. Sorry, I'm hearing someone else. But so in other words, though, one of the things that we were trying to do was look at how to actually integrate workforce development, places for children to play, multi-generational housing, and then additional sorts of outdoor amenities that could foster restorative justice. For those of you who are not aware, restorative justice is a practice, specifically an Indigenous practice, that is used especially in nonviolent offenses, where the person who's been convicted of a crime or accused of a crime, the victim of that crime, and their community members come together to talk about the crime that occurred and then how to move forward from that. And so this project is really trying to understand how we can use that as an architectural condition within the site plan. So you go to the next slide. I'm just going to show you 3 of those very special spaces, restorative justice facilities. So this was one actually elevated within a courtyard, so you actually get a canopy view of the trees beyond it, a space for 4 or 5 people to come together to sit and talk about the crime that occurred. If you go to the next slide. A space that's actually a semi-indoor outdoor space, which would be also used as an art gallery, a series of different walls and intersecting glass planes, where you can get insertions of light and wind and the elements and be outside. And then also have a place for people who otherwise are extraordinarily expressive and have a huge abundance of murals and wall art in the community, invite them to come here and actually activate this space. Next slide. And then this is another one which I called Flower Field, which is actually immersed within a courtyard and is surrounded by a field of wildflowers. A thing that in the community engagement that I did for this project learned was that people were really, they romanticized sort of the Newark of the past, which was a city of brick, a city where people had rose gardens in the front and rose gardens in the back. And a lot of that textural element has been lost. And so finding things that are familiar and then actually bring them back. And so if you go to the next slide, I just want to share a few other precedents for what we can look at outside of the American context, as well as within America. So this is a prison facility, which is considered one of the best in the world in terms of best practices. It's called Halden Prison, which is a maximum security facility in Halden, Norway. If you were to go to this facility, you would have, besides the fact that there are the very tall concrete walls surrounding the outside of it, you would have no idea that it's a maximum security prison. And literally some of the most highest offenders in the country are living here. In this facility, and along with sort of Norway's policies and their framework for how people are treated once they've been incarcerated, every single person that lives there is a person. They're not an inmate. You have to know them by name. They don't have a number. They don't have uniforms. They wear street clothes. They wear what they want. They each have their own room, their own private bathroom. They can decorate as they choose. They can have food in their room. They have the flexibility to live their life. There's a series of landscaping and hills and hiking paths. There's conjugal cabins, effectively, so you can bring your family within the prison walls as you're rehabilitating. And in conjunction with really robust public policy that supports people's re-entry into civilization, it's a really good precedent for how to move forward, not just within prison systems ourselves, but outside of that system. If you go to the next slide. A parallel precedent for this would be Finland's criminal justice system. And so this is basically like a lower tier prison, what they call an open prison in Finland on Suomen Island. And in this particular facility, there's about 300 residents. Again, they are not inmates, they're not felons, they're not convicts, they are residents. They actually call them clients by law in Finland. And this particular facility, the clients live in homes which are, no more than 8 people per home. There's a den dad, they make their own meals, they can farm if they like, they actually get rights to work outside of the campus. So they can take a ferry into Helsinki proper. There is a series and sense of rights that you have within this facility that in America we just don't have. And I wish I could show you like tons of more pictures. I've been to both these facilities and they are beautiful. This one feels a little bit more like a summer camp, admittedly, but it's a really beautiful way of showing how we can humanize people who otherwise have been demonized in societies like our own. If you go to the last slide. And I just want to share a really great American precedent, one of which is called A New Way of Life. It's based out of Los Angeles, California, and it was started by Dr. Susan Burton, who herself was incarcerated 6 times after the death of her 6-year-old son. And Susan basically realized after her 6th stint in prison that she needed a better life. She needed help with drug rehabilitation and she needs family support. And so she, with another person, bought a house to then help rehabilitate other women. They now own over 13 homes throughout the county and have also just recently acquired a nunnery. I'm not sure that's the right word for it, but a nunnery, where they are now inviting women in droves to come in and rehabilitate together. And they really believe in sort of this one-on-one model of, staff to resident, where it's all about bringing people home welcoming them back to society. And these are all just precedents that we can look at, not just from, again, like the door handle or the window, but how they actually start to be embedded within urban footprints and within communities, and helping to normalize them, because these conditions are a failure of society at large, not just failures of individuals. And I think taking that person-centered perspective, and I think a lot of us have underlying biases that we really need to question as we approach this work, in a level of humanity that we need in approaching this work, and humility as well, to understand that these people are people first, and that these are traumas that have caused people to behave in certain ways, that the systems have failed them. And so I leave you with this. If you have not heard of them, I would go to their website. It's an amazing organization. She's actually now opening safe houses across the country and also in different parts of Africa. And it's a really great model, and they've had a great success in rehabilitating women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. That was fantastic. And I think we've certainly heard about a couple of very different types of approaches, all of which create more welcoming spaces for people who have had lots of different types of experiences. We do have some questions in the chat, and I do want to encourage folks to continue using the chat. I didn't mention it at the outset, but we don't wait until the end for questions here. We like to incorporate throughout. And also, I know many of you work in this space as well, so we'd love to hear your examples, include your links to the work that you're doing, and please share those things. We have two questions that are specific to windows and safety. One of them is specific about bulletproof glass and the implications of using that, but also recognizing that sometimes, just because of the issues we have with in the United States with violence, gun violence and such, that sometimes that's necessary. So I was wondering if any of you could speak to that.
I'm happy to take a quick try. So I think, first of all, there are definitely all kinds of legitimate concerns around safety. And when we do projects, we're looking very carefully at the context and at all kinds of different safety and security issues. I feel like there has to be a balance and a sort of a realistic approach. We have a really good consultant that we use for active threat security, and there are patterns about the way these things happen. And what we found is that outside windows, especially if they can just be a little bit higher up or within protected areas like outdoor playground spaces, are really low risk. They're very, you can't do everything. We're not all going to live in bunkers underground, right? So I think it's really a question of analyzing the risk, and then also really valuing the value of natural light and views and things like that. The second thing I would say is that even given that, then there is a design component where I think if you're careful about how and where glass and glazing is used and what kind of glazing you use, because see something else about bulletproof glass in the chat. There are ways of hardening openings, against intruders that are really invisible. So I think there are good examples. In our experience, what the heightened real threat and heightened perceived threat that we're surrounded with today, it's one more thing that you have to think about, and it tends to add cost to projects as well. But I really don't feel like it should lessen, the need for things like natural light and connection to the outdoors.
Thanks, Mike. Dana, Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always this balance, right? I think as we think about designing, it's why we've created our trauma-informed design process, where we really seek to have all of these, like, Deborah, as an educator, thank you first, as we think about all of the problems we're trying to solve in design, we at Shopwork seek to have these values conversations really early on and talk to a lot of different people, right? And so when we're designing, say, a homeless shelter, right, we're talking to leadership staff there at the table kind of throughout the whole process, but then frontline staff. What doesn't feel safe in this building at 2 a.m., right? Having those conversations and then talking to guests, like, where do you like connecting to staff? In one of our shelters, we created this beautiful bathroom, and people love bringing chairs into the bathroom and sitting in the bathroom, right? Great. The rest of the building's also beautiful, but awesome, the best lights in the bathroom, you know? So I do think there is in trauma-informed design this push and pull, because I also think staff have their own vicarious trauma from real experiences that are really important. And how do we balance that? Because when we create spaces that feel healing and, you know, maybe don't have a plexiglass front desk, right, when you open, right? When you walk into the Dolores Project shelter, you walk into a living room and staff are there with a clipboard. Yeah, a guest who's having a really hard day can come in there and they can actually be a threat to staff. But our hope is that the building environment itself and the staff trained in de-escalation can use this space that feels healing and invite them to step out into the courtyard or sit on this rocking chair, right? So I do think trauma-informed design is this dance over, let's make sure this space is safe and feels safe, and let's not make sure that we're designing these things that only prioritize staff safety, because then we design spaces that don't let guests put their guard down, right? And the research shows, biophilia shows, right? When folks are in these spaces, it helps us heal. It helps us get out of our fight, flight, and freeze. And so we also have to trust that the staff and the building can work together to create that safety.
Yeah, I would just like to add, I think there historically, we've, as architects, we really relied on sort of a defensiveness in design, and, you know, bars on in windows and really sort of fortified spaces and the hardened materials. And I think in trauma-informed design, we need to lean into what feels right and what feels comfortable, because it does really have sort of a psychological impact in calming people down. With that said, I think there does need to be a feedback loop and sort of an evaluation as these new projects are coming out to really understand if those new techniques that we're using are effectively operating. So I know of a project called New Beginnings in Laurel, Maryland, which is the city of DC's juvenile detention facility. When New Beginnings was built over a decade ago, it was supposed to be the state-of-the-art thing. It was all really leaning into trauma-informed design. And I think they might have overcompensated in sort of the de-escalation of the design interventions, and it didn't really work. And so I think we have to understand, again, who we're designing for, also allowing for a sense of flexibility. And so if modifications do need to change because it's not working in full, maybe these are spaces in which we can kind of think more flexibly and more creatively. But I do think that there has to be sort of a feedback loop between how things are operating and how they're, and you know, also things might de-escalate in time too, as people start to occupy these spaces. So you have to kind of work with the people to understand how the rooms and the environments are working.
I think another really interesting thing, what both of you are bringing up, is for us this idea that number one, most real threats, because there are real threats in the projects that we work on, don't come from strangers from the outside. You know, they come from things like parental conflict or custody or things like that. And the people who work in the DCF centers, they're very conscious of that and they've lived those things. And we're asking them, what we're saying is we're trying to provide an environment that allows you to trust more, right? And I think it sounds like that's the case in incarceration and in homeless too. We're asking the staff to not be afraid and not be defensive, but to trust. And I believe that there are things that we can do from a design standpoint that allow staff to be less on their guard, just because of the way that things are set up, because they can see what's going on, because they, you know, there's just a better arrangement of space and materials.
So I'm going to blend two questions here again. We have a question that somebody's asking about pushback that you might get from folks who feel like perhaps somebody's not worthy of like having a high quality space, which is making a judgment. But I also, and perhaps I shouldn't, but due to time, I'm going to combine that question with barriers, any other barriers that you may face. You know, government at the state and local level is our primary audience here. So would love for you all to address one or both, kind of in terms of barriers or pursuing work with government agencies for more trauma-informed design. And again, I'm not trying to impose the idea that you face this in government, but would just love it. You can tackle one or the other. So Dana, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, it is something we face all the time. And I think for me, and especially in my consulting practice, one of the things I can't harp on enough is you have to do engagement, not just with the population of people who are going to be living and using these spaces, but with others who are living around these spaces and with others who might have influence in these spaces. So I'm working on a pretty significant project in Los Angeles County that's looking at citywide alternatives to incarceration strategies. And half of our engagement budget is really about like PSAs and bringing in community members who have no involvement with the system to understand and break down those things. And that engagement is happening way long before we're even putting pen to paper. Because if we don't have community buy-in at large, we don't have political buy-in, there's no way of making these projects they're not going to have legs in the long term. And so there's a lot of unlearning in that case. We work a lot with videos and testimonies from people who have that system impact, and also try to really break down that it's not just like one person. It's not just like with homelessness, it's not just this one, it's on like a lot of times people in their minds are thinking it's someone who's like a middle-aged or an older gentleman. It's also children, it's women, it's people of color, it's veterans. And so breaking down those populations and making it more attainable for people to understand who these people really are and that they're people again.
I'll jump into, I mean, I think all of the studies demonstrate that when you give people beautiful spaces, they can connect to hope and make different life choices for themselves. And so I think a lot of our spaces do that. It's every system is uniquely designed to produce the results it gets. And our education and to prison pipeline is created that way, including how the building is designed. And so when we think that human beings don't deserve things that are beautiful, and then we get mad at them for staying stuck in their trauma responses and not healing, we who have power are the ones who are purposely keeping them there. And so I do think everybody deserves a beautiful home, and the research demonstrates, and we push back against this in cities and funders all the time. So I love this question, it's really important. But the research demonstrates if you give people good spaces and healing spaces, then they can take those healing steps that we're expecting them to take. And I'll say, as it relates to the barriers, I think one of the barriers to this work is the deep engagement that has to happen before, say, for housing, any project has any funding, and everything is being done at risk by the developer and the architect and the nonprofits. And so I do think, here in Colorado, we've had great partners from our Colorado Housing and Finance Authority and our Division of Housing to think creatively about how we support this work on the front end when nobody has the money to do it.
Can I jump in on just adding to that, like really more tactical is, in my work with DCF, it's a big old system and it just does what it does. And people are, we always hear, that's a great idea, but this is how we've always done it. No matter what it is, like switching from the fax machine to email was like a big 20-year thing. Because they're just big systems. And what we've had a lot of success with is saying to people, this is a pilot. We're gonna do one office. We're gonna show you what it looks like, one office before and after, and you can go in there and feel it. So, the idea of a pilot, and in our case, the pilot was privately funded. So all this redesign renovation work we did, I raised the money to do it. But now it's part of the DCF budget for office space. And that's the other thing is, oh my God, it's going to cost more money. We don't have enough money in our budget. And it's been really valuable for me to say, look, here are the vendors that you're allowed to buy from. And here's the website. Like, see this black metal chair that's really uncomfortable? Right next to it on that website is a wooden chair that has a padded seat, that is a neutral color, that has, it's wood, like, and people are like, oh, I'm like, look, this one costs $99.99. This one costs $99.99. So instead of just doing what you always do and buying 100 black metal chairs, maybe just, choose the next SKU in the line and buy something that is trauma informed and more comfortable and still durable, still, still within budget, but just a little nicer. So it's just these, helping people take little bites at a time.
I would just add one more thing that Mrs. Baker is too modest to say, and that is that having a true champion for this idea makes a huge difference. And it's not an arm twisting thing, although sometimes it's an arm twisting thing. It's also just giving people permission to think, about a different future and a different way of doing things. Because I think a lot of people we found at all levels of the organization in DCF are incredibly committed to the welfare of the children and families. And they have a lot of really great ideas. But I think over time, they just kind of gets ingrained that things aren't going to change, and maybe they try to change things in little ways and it doesn't really work out, or maybe it does. But I think to be able to identify within whatever organization or bureaucracy or whatever you're in, a champion who can really push these ideas and give people permission to think out of the box is huge.
Thanks, Mike. We have other questions coming in, and we will work offline with our experts here to try and get answers back to folks after the fact. Dana, Laura, any final thoughts you want to leave us with? We just heard some great ideas from Lauren and Mike about things that you should be thinking about. But as states and local government are thinking about how to incorporate these ideas, any single final thought you want to leave them with? Dana or Laura, you're off mute first. Go ahead. Sorry.
Make sure you're engaging with the folks who aren't at the table making decisions. Talk to people, ask them how they experience safety, community, connection, and believe them and design for them, and not for the executive director or the main client contact.
I would just add to always ask questions. If you don't know the answer, don't make an assumption. Assumptions can hurt people more than they will help a lot of the times. And so that's when, engaging with the people who are most vulnerable is critical. So just ask. It doesn't take that much time.
Thank you. Well, I want to really thank our speakers today. This was an absolutely fantastic session. I feel like every session is my favorite session until we have the next one, and then that's my favorite session. You guys have been fantastic. So many resources to share. And again, I see folks asking follow-up questions. Please feel free to contact us. The Pathways website has a place where you can reach out if you've got follow-up questions. I did want to remind everyone that our next call is on June 13th, and it is about preventing violence and helping survivors heal with trauma responsive policies and practices. Please go and register today. And then on July 19th, we'll be discussing building trauma responsive networks of care. So all connected topics, and we're really excited that everyone joined today. And again, thank you to our speakers. I hope that everyone has a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you.